There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, moments that you only recognize as pivotal in the rearview mirror of memory. They are rarely loud or dramatic. They don't announce themselves with trumpets or a parting of the clouds. Instead, they slip in quietly, wearing the drab clothing of a Tuesday evening, a shared pizza, a movie neither of you is watching. They are the moments that, when you later trace the entire architecture of your happiness back to its foundation, you find them there, a single, unassuming cornerstone upon which everything else was built. For me, that moment smelled of old books and the lavender laundry detergent Julian used, and it was defined by the 6 inches of couch cushion that separated our bodies, a space that felt as vast as an ocean and as thin as a prayer. He had whispered it, his voice a low vibration against the fabric of my t-shirt, his breath warm on the side of my neck where his head was resting. It wasn't a question, not really. It was a plea, a confession, and a dare, all bundled into 4 gut-wrenching words. Tell me to stop. My own breath hitched, caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat, a fragile bird trapped in a cage of ribs. My heart, which had been hammering a frantic, unsteady rhythm against my bones for the better part of an hour, suddenly felt like it had stopped altogether, suspended in the thick, humming silence of my apartment. The only sounds were the distant drone of city traffic and the manufactured drama spilling from the television, a soundtrack to a scene that had become entirely, terrifyingly real. I didn't say a word. I couldn't, because to tell him to stop would have been the most profound lie I had ever told, and to tell him to continue felt like a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. So I remained silent, and in that silence, I gave him my answer. Before that night, before the couch became our confessional and the space between us a charged filament, Julian and I existed in a different geography. Our friendship was a sprawling, comfortable country with well-defined borders. We had met in a sophomore-level art history class, a prerequisite neither of us wanted to take. I was there because it was a requirement for my photography major, a box to be checked. Julian was there, as he'd later tell me, because his advisor said it was an easy A and his schedule was already brutal with upper division computer science courses. He was all bright energy and easy smiles, the kind of person who collected friends like other people collected loose change. He sat next to me on the first day, his leg bouncing with a restless energy that seemed to vibrate through the floor, and asked if I had a spare pen. I had 3, all identical black gel pens, arranged neatly in my bag. I handed one over without a word, and he gave me a grin that was like a sudden burst of sunlight in the dim, stuffy lecture hall. That was the beginning. Our friendship grew in the interstitial spaces of college life. In late-night study sessions at the library where I would sketch compositions in my notebook, while he wrestled with lines of code that looked like an alien language to me. In the shared misery of the campus dining hall, where we'd critique the questionable food with the gravity of world-renowned chefs. On long walks across the sprawling green of the main quad, talking about everything and nothing. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of social engagements, intramural soccer games, and ambitious projects. I was his quiet counterpoint, the calm eye of his storm. I was the one he came to when the world got too loud, when the pressure of his own relentless momentum became too much. I was his harbor. It was a role I slipped into so naturally, so completely, that I didn't realize until much later that I had built my own life around the shape of his. My feelings for him didn't arrive in a thunderclap. They developed slowly, like a photograph submerged in a chemical bath, an image gradually emerging from the ether. It began as a deep, abiding affection, the kind of fierce loyalty you feel for a brother. But then, small things started to shift the focus. It was the way the late afternoon light would catch the gold flecks in his brown eyes when he was laughing about something, turning them the color of warm honey. It was the unconscious way he would reach out and touch my arm when he was making a point, a casual point of contact that would leave my skin tingling for minutes afterward. It was watching him across a crowded room, seeing him hold the attention of a dozen people with effortless charm, and feeling a strange, proprietary ache in my chest, a secret pride mixed with a sharp pang of loneliness. I was a photographer. My life was about observation, about noticing the details others missed. I saw the way his smile didn't always reach his eyes, especially after a grueling week. I saw the flicker of exhaustion he tried to hide behind a joke. I saw the moments of quiet vulnerability he showed to no one else, the times he would fall silent and just stare out the window of my dorm room, his usual kinetic energy stilled for a precious, fleeting moment. I captured these things, not with my camera, but with my memory. I stored them away, a secret collection of images that were for my eyes only. And as this collection grew, so did the feeling inside me, clarifying from a vague wash of affection into a sharp, undeniable ache. It was love. It was quiet and patient and utterly hopeless. He was, for the entire duration of our friendship, never single. There was always a girlfriend, a succession of bright, pretty girls who seemed to fit so seamlessly into the vibrant tapestry of his life. There was Emily in sophomore year, a dancer with a laugh like wind chimes. Then came Jessica, a pre-law student with a fierce intelligence that challenged him. And then there was Sarah. Sarah was different. She wasn't a brief chapter. She was a volume. They met senior year and moved in together after graduation. She was kind and smart and beautiful, and she loved Julian in a way that was obvious to everyone. Their Christmas cards were always on my fridge, a smiling portrait of domestic bliss. I liked Sarah truly. I saw how she smoothed out his rough edges, how her calm presence seemed to soothe his restless soul. And every time I saw them together, happy and perfect, I would carefully pack my own feelings away, placing them in a locked room at the back of my mind. I told myself that his happiness was the most important thing. It was a mantra I repeated until I almost believed it. Friendship was the foundation we had built, and I would sooner tear myself apart than risk putting a single crack in it. After college, we ended up in the same city, a happy accident of job offers and geographic convenience. He was a software engineer at a fast-growing tech firm, and I was trying to make a go of it as a freelance photographer, shooting portraits, weddings, anything to pay the rent on my small, light-filled apartment. My place became our neutral ground, a refuge from his life with Sarah and my life of solitary work. It was an unspoken arrangement. He would text me, "Bad day, need the couch," and I would make sure there was cold beer in the fridge and that the clutter of my camera equipment was pushed to one side. He would collapse onto my worn-out sofa, sighing as if he were releasing the weight of the entire world, and I would sit in the armchair opposite, listening as he talked about bugs in his code, frustrations with his boss, or the minor, mundane disagreements he and Sarah were having about what color to paint the living room. I was the observer, the listener. It was our dynamic, the rhythm we had established over years. It was safe. It was contained. The shift began on a Tuesday in October. The air had that crisp, melancholic edge that signals the true arrival of autumn. The leaves on the trees outside my window were a riot of gold and crimson, a last, defiant blaze of glory before the fall. I was in my darkroom, the red safe light casting an eerie, monastic glow over everything, when my phone buzzed insistently on the shelf where I'd left it. It was Julian. I ignored the first call, my hands submerged in the developer, watching an image of a bride and groom slowly materialize on the paper. He called again, and again. On the fourth call, a knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. Julian knew not to call when I was in the darkroom unless it was an emergency. I quickly moved the print to the stop bath, rinsed my hands, and answered, my voice tight. "Leo." His voice was wrecked. It was hollowed out, scraped raw, a sound I had never heard from him before. It was the sound of a building collapsing. "Julian? What's wrong? Where are you?" There was a long, ragged breath on the other end of the line. "It's over," he said, and the two words were so heavy they seemed to suck all the air out of my small, dark space. "Sarah and me. It's over." I didn't need to ask for details. I just said, "Stay where you are. I'm coming." I found him sitting on a park bench not far from the apartment he and Sarah had shared for 3 years. He was just staring at the steady stream of cars on the street, his shoulders slumped, his hands dangling between his knees. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, diminished, as if some vital part of him had been carved away. He had a small duffel bag at his feet. I sat down next to him, leaving a careful, respectful distance between us. For a long time, we didn't speak. I just sat with him in the fading light, a silent sentinel guarding his grief. The wind picked up, scattering a handful of dry leaves across our feet. Finally, he turned to me, his eyes red-rimmed and lost. "She said she feels more like my mother than my partner," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual warmth. that I'm always looking for something, always restless, and she's just tired of trying to be my anchor. The word hung in the air between us. Anchor. The very thing Sarah was tired of being was the one thing I had always been for him, quietly and without expectation. A bitter, inappropriate wave of something that wasn't quite triumph washed over me, and I hated myself for it instantly. This was my best friend, shattered and adrift, and my own selfish heart was finding a glimmer of something hopeful in his wreckage. I pushed the feeling down, burying it deep. "You can stay with me," I said. It wasn't a question. He looked at me, a flicker of his old self in his eyes, a deep, bone-weary gratitude. "Just for a few days," he said. "Until I figure things out, for as long as you need." I corrected him gently. And so, he came home with me. The geography of our friendship began to change that night. The well-defined borders started to blur. He had crossed a line, not into my country, but out of his own, and had washed up, shipwrecked, on my shore. I helped him carry his bag up the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, the silence between us thick with everything that had just happened. When I unlocked my door and flicked on the light, the familiar space of my home felt different. It was no longer just my sanctuary. It was now his refuge. He dropped his bag by the door and stood in the middle of the living room, looking around as if he'd never seen it before. He looked like a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. That first night, he took the couch. I offered him my bed, insisting it was no trouble, that I could take the sofa, but he refused. He shook his head, a small, stubborn gesture. "No, man. This is enough. More than enough." I gave him a set of clean sheets, a pillow, and the thick quilt my grandmother had made. As I was heading to my bedroom, he called my name. I turned. He was standing by the couch, the bedding clutched in his hands, looking impossibly small in the soft glow of the lamp. "Leo," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Thank you, it's what we do," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. "Go to sleep, Julian." I closed my bedroom door, but I didn't get into bed. I stood with my back against the cool wood, listening to the quiet sounds of him settling in. The rustle of sheets, the soft thud of the pillow being adjusted, the long, shuddering sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken griefs. I had never been so aware of another person's presence in my home. He was just on the other side of the door, a thin barrier of wood and paint separating my world from the raw, open wound of his. And I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that nothing would ever be the same again. The foundation had shifted. A fault line had appeared, and I had no idea if the ground beneath our feet would hold. The first few days were a blur of careful navigation. Julian moved through my apartment like a shadow, quiet and apologetic. He'd make his bed on the couch every morning with military precision, folding the quilt into a neat square, as if trying to minimize his presence, to take up as little space as possible. He spent hours on the phone, talking in low, tense tones to his parents, to Sarah, to a realtor. I moved around him, a silent satellite in a new and uncertain orbit. I made coffee for 2 in the mornings. I bought groceries he liked without asking. I worked, editing photos at my desk with headphones on, giving him the illusion of privacy while being acutely, constantly aware of his every movement, every sigh, every restless shift of weight on the couch. The ritual began about a week after he moved in. It started, as most of these things did, with a movie. It was a Friday night. Julian had spent the day packing up the last of his things from his old apartment, a grim, final act of severance. He came back to my place looking hollowed out, his face pale and strained. He didn't speak, just dropped his keys on the counter and collapsed onto the couch. I ordered a pizza, his favorite, pepperoni and jalapeno, and put on a mindless action movie, something loud and distracting. We ate in near silence, sitting on opposite ends of the sofa, the pizza box a buffer zone between us. Halfway through the film, during a particularly loud car chase, he shifted. He drew his legs up, turned on his side to face the television, and rested his head on the arm of the sofa. A few minutes later, I felt a subtle change in the tension of the cushions. I glanced over. His eyes were closed. His breathing was deep and even. He had fallen asleep, utterly exhausted. My first instinct was to wake him, to tell him to go to his makeshift bed, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. He looked so peaceful, so unguarded. The deep lines of stress on his forehead had smoothed out. For the first time in a week, He didn't look broken. He just looked like Julian. So I stayed. I sat there for another hour, the movie playing out to an empty audience, every nerve in my body humming with a hyper-awareness of his proximity. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. I could see the way his eyelashes, surprisingly long, brushed against his cheek. My own body was rigid, a statue of feigned nonchalance. I was terrified to move, to breathe too loudly, lest I disturb this fragile truce he had found with the world. Eventually, the credits rolled, and the screen went black, plunging the room into a soft darkness broken only by the orange glow of the streetlights outside. I knew I should move. I knew I should wake him, but my limbs felt like they were filled with lead. This quiet, unintentional closeness felt like a secret I was being trusted with, a precious, fragile thing. The next night, it happened again. This time, it felt less like an accident and more like an unspoken question. We were watching another movie, and he just leaned. He didn't fall asleep right away. He just tilted his body towards mine, a slow, deliberate drift, until his head came to rest on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. It was the most electrifying, terrifying thing I had ever felt. His hair was soft against my jaw. His weight was a solid, grounding presence. I could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing through the fabric of my shirt. It was an act of such profound, casual trust that it stole my breath. I sat there, my arm trapped awkwardly between us, my heart pounding a deafening rhythm in my ears, and pretended it was the most natural thing in the world. I pretended it meant nothing. And everything. This became our new normal. The ritual. Every night, we would end up on the couch. The pretense of watching a movie became thinner and thinner. Sometimes we would talk, his voice a low murmur as he rested against me, recounting the frustrating search for a new apartment or a funny story from work. More often, we would sit in silence, the only sound our shared breathing. He would fall asleep on my shoulder, and I would sit there for hours, my own need for sleep forgotten, just soaking in the impossible reality of his closeness. It was a strange, liminal space we had created, a place that was not quite friendship and not yet something more. It was a nightly ritual of ambiguous intimacy, steeped in plausible deniability. He was grieving. He needed comfort. I was his friend. I was providing it. The logic was sound, a fortress I built around my heart to protect it from the hope that was starting to bloom like a dangerous, beautiful weed. I became a scholar of his smallest gestures. I learned the difference between the sigh of exhaustion and the sigh of contentment. I learned the way his hand would sometimes twitch in his sleep, his fingers brushing against my leg, a fleeting touch that would send a jolt through my entire system. I learned the specific weight and warmth of him, a sensory imprint that I started to carry with me throughout my days. My world, which had once been a wide landscape, had narrowed to the space of my living room, to the geography of my couch, to the few inches that separated my body from his. My own work began to suffer. I would find myself staring at a newly developed portrait, a face of a stranger, and all I could see were the details of Julian's face in my mind's eye. The process of creation, once a refuge, now felt like a pale imitation of the intense, focused observation I was dedicating to him. One night, about a month into this new arrangement, the ritual escalated. It had been a particularly bad day for him. The apartment he thought he had secured had fallen through at the last minute. He was frustrated and dejected, pacing my small living room like a caged animal. "I feel so untethered, Leo," he said, finally stopping to run a hand through his hair. "Like I don't have a single solid thing to stand on." Later that night, after our usual silent session on the couch, as I was about to get up and leave him to sleep, he stirred. His head lifted from my shoulder, and he looked at me, his eyes clouded with sleep and something else I couldn't name. "Don't go," he mumbled, his voice thick. My heart stuttered. "Julian, you need to sleep." "I'll just be in my room." "No," he said, his voice a little clearer, more insistent. He shifted, moving away from me and patting the space beside him on the narrow couch. "Stay?" "Just for a bit." It was a line. I knew it was a line. To stay would be to admit that this was more than just comfort, more than friendship. It would be stepping out of the fortress of plausible deniability and into open, uncharted territory. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to get up, to say goodnight, to retreat to the safety of my own room. But the part of me that had been quietly, patiently loving this man for years The part that ached with the sheer, overwhelming proximity of him couldn't move. I slowly, hesitantly, stretched my legs out on the couch, my back pressed against the cushions, my body a stiff, straight line next to his. For a few minutes, we lay there in silence, not touching, two bodies sharing a small space, the air between us crackling with unspoken words. Then, he shifted again. He rolled onto his side, facing me, and in one fluid, sleepy movement, he threw an arm over my waist and buried his face in the crook of my neck. And that was it. The fortress crumbled. The walls came down. His breath was hot against my skin. His arm was a heavy, possessive weight around me. It was not the chaste, accidental comfort of a head on a shoulder. This was an embrace. It was deliberate, and it was devastating. I lay there, rigid as a board, my mind racing. This had to be a mistake. He was asleep, or half asleep. He didn't know what he was doing. He thought I was Sarah. He was just reaching for a comfort that was no longer there. I cataloged every excuse, every rationalization, trying to find one that would stick, one that would allow me to put this moment back in its box. But none of them felt true. The truth was the solid, undeniable weight of his arm over me. The truth was the feeling of his chest rising and falling against my side. The truth was that he had pulled me closer, not pushed me away. Eventually, my own body, exhausted from the emotional whiplash, betrayed me. My muscles began to relax against my will. My breathing deepened, syncing with his. Tentatively, slowly, I lifted my own arm and let it rest on his back, my hand splayed between his shoulder blades. He responded with a soft sigh, nestling even closer. It was a moment of surrender. I was giving in to the dangerous, intoxicating hope that this was real, that this meant something. We slept like that for hours, tangled together on my narrow couch. Two halves of a whole that I had never dared to imagine could exist. When I woke up just before dawn, stiff and sore, he was still holding me. The early morning light, pale and gray, filtered through the window, illuminating the peaceful expression on his face. In that moment, watching him sleep, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my side, I felt a sense of rightness so profound it almost hurt. It felt like coming home. The escalation became the new baseline. Sharing the couch was no longer enough. A few nights after the first time we slept intertwined, he looked at my closed bedroom door with a tired, almost wistful expression. "Your bed has to be more comfortable than this couch," he stated, more to himself than to me. I held my breath, waiting. He turned to me, a hesitant, questioning look in his eyes. "Would it be weird if I just slept in there?" "The couch is killing my back," he rushed the excuse out, as if he needed to justify the request immediately. "You can have the bed, of course. I can just take the floor. It's probably softer than this thing anyway. Don't be an idiot, Julian," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "The bed is big enough for two." It was another line crossed, another border dissolved. That night, for the first time, we shared my bed. It was a vast, terrifying expanse compared to the couch. We lay on our separate sides, backs to each other, a careful foot of space between us. The silence was deafening. I was so aware of him, of his breathing, of the warmth radiating from his body, that I couldn't sleep. I felt like a tightly coiled spring. After what felt like an eternity, he rolled over. I felt the mattress dip with his movement. "Leo," he whispered into the darkness. "Yeah." I whispered back, my voice hoarse. "Can't sleep." "Me neither." Another long pause. Then, I felt his hand on my back, a gentle, hesitant touch. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The question was so vulnerable, so full of uncertainty, that it broke my heart a little. He wasn't the confident, charming Julian I had always known. He was someone new, someone tentative and questioning. I didn't answer with words. I just rolled over to face him. In the gloom of the bedroom, I could just make out the shape of his face, the dark pools of his eyes. He moved closer, and the ritual we had established on the couch found its new home in my bed. He wrapped his arms around me, pulled me against his chest, and buried his face in my hair. I wrapped my own arms around him, holding him tightly. There were no more pretenses. There were no more excuses about comfort or grief. This was something else. This was a choice we were both making, night after night, in the quiet, honest darkness. We existed in this bubble for weeks. By day, we were friends, roommates. We made coffee, we talked about work, we paid bills. But by night, The world shrank to the confines of my queen-sized bed, and we were something else entirely, something undefined and fragile. We never spoke of it in the daylight. It was a secret we kept even from ourselves. The door to my bedroom would close, and the unspoken rules of the outside world would fall away, replaced by this one simple truth: we needed to hold each other to get through the night. The physical intimacy became a language of its own, a way of saying all the things we were too afraid to put into words. His hand stroking my hair was, "I'm here," my arm around his waist was, "Don't leave," his leg tangled with mine was, "You're not alone." I lived for the nights, for the moment the door closed, and the performance of friendship could end. But the days became a new kind of torture. The ambiguity was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety beneath the surface of everything. I would watch him laugh at something on his phone and wonder, does he feel it too? Or am I just a human security blanket? A temporary comfort he'll discard once he's healed. The fear of misinterpreting everything was a cold weight in my gut. I was living in a state of suspended animation, caught between the sheer joy of his closeness and the paralyzing terror that it was all just a beautiful, heartbreaking illusion. I was a photographer who had become obsessed with a single subject, analyzing every frame, every flicker of light and shadow, searching for a truth that remained just out of focus. This beautiful, agonizing stasis felt like it could last forever, but I knew, deep down, that it couldn't. Something had to break. The breaking point arrived, as these things do, on an evening that felt just like any other. It was a Thursday. A light rain was misting against the window panes, blurring the city lights into a soft, impressionistic watercolor. We were on the couch, a habit we had fallen back into for our evenings before retreating to the bedroom. A quiet jazz station was playing on the stereo, filling the room with melancholy saxophone notes. We weren't touching, just sitting side by side, a comfortable foot of space between us. The tension, however, was anything but comfortable. It had been building for days, a palpable pressure in the air. The unspoken thing between us had grown so large it was taking up all the oxygen in the room. He had been quiet all evening, his gaze distant. I could feel the restlessness coming off him in waves, a familiar energy that had been muted for weeks. He was getting better. The raw edges of his grief were smoothing over. He was starting to look like his old self again. And with that healing came a terrifying thought. He wouldn't need me anymore. The ritual, our secret language of the night, had been born of his brokenness. What would happen now that he was starting to feel whole again? The fear was a cold dread coiling in my stomach. He turned to me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Leo," he said, his voice low. He didn't continue, just held my gaze. It felt like he was searching for something, an answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. My heart started its familiar, frantic drumming. This felt different. This was not the sleepy, mumbled need of the past few months. This was conscious. This was awake. Slowly, deliberately, he closed the distance between us. He didn't lie down or lean his head on my shoulder. He just moved closer, inch by agonizing inch, until our knees were touching, until I could feel the warmth of his body alongside mine. He lifted a hand, and I flinched, expecting him to touch my arm or my shoulder in that familiar, friendly way. But he didn't. His hand hovered in the space between us for a heart-stopping second before coming to rest gently on my jaw, his thumb stroking softly along my cheekbone. The touch was electric. It was not the touch of a friend. It was not the touch of someone seeking mindless comfort. It was a question. It was a statement. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was pinned in place by his gaze, by the shocking, tender intimacy of his touch. The world narrowed to that single point of contact, his thumb brushing against my skin. It felt like he was reading my entire history in that one small gesture, all the years of quiet observation, of secret, hopeless love. He leaned in closer, his face just inches from mine. I could see the reflection of my own wide, terrified eyes in his. His gaze dropped to my lips, and then back up to my eyes. The air was so thick I felt like I was drowning in it. And then he whispered it, the four words that shattered the beautiful, fragile world we had built. "Tell me to stop." It was an echo of 1,000 unspoken conversations we'd had in the dark. It was the culmination of every shared silence, every hesitant touch, every night spent tangled together in my bed. He was laying it all bare. He was giving me the power, the control. He was offering me an escape route, a way to rewind, to pretend this moment never happened, to retreat to the safety of our friendship. Tell me to stop, and we can go back. Tell me to stop, and I'll pretend I never wanted this. Tell me to stop, and you can keep your heart safe. My mind was a maelstrom of panic and longing. The photographer in me saw the scene with perfect, painful clarity. The way the lamplight carved a sharp line along his jaw, the subtle tremor in his hand as he held my face, the raw vulnerability in his eyes. Years of self-preservation, of carefully banking the fires of my own feelings, screamed at me to say the words. Stop. Don't do this. Don't risk the one person you can't bear to lose. But my heart, that stubborn, foolish organ, had been waiting its entire life for this single, terrifying moment of truth. I met his gaze. I let him see everything I had kept hidden for so long. The fear, the hope, the years of unending, unrequited love. I parted my lips, as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, I leaned forward, just a fraction of an inch, closing the last remaining space between us. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. He took my silence, my small movement, as the permission it was. He closed his eyes and pressed his lips to mine. The kiss was nothing like I had ever imagined. It wasn't passionate or demanding. It was tentative. It was soft. It was a question, a confession, and an apology all at once. It was the taste of salt from the rain on his lips and the overwhelming, undeniable taste of home. It was the gentlest of collisions, a quiet yielding. All the tension that had been building for months, for years, finally found its release, not in a crash, but in a soft, quiet sigh of surrender that seemed to pass from his lips to mine. My hand came up to rest on his chest, feeling the frantic, wild beating of his heart beneath my palm, a mirror to my own. In that moment, with the jazz playing softly and the rain whispering against the glass, the entire world fell away. There was only this. There was only him. And for the first time, there was the breathtaking, terrifying possibility of us. The aftermath of a storm is a strange, quiet thing. The air is clean, the world seems unnaturally still, and the landscape is irrevocably altered. The morning after the kiss felt exactly like that. I woke up first, as I always did. Julian was still asleep, his arm thrown protectively over my chest, his face peaceful in the pale morning light. Nothing and everything had changed. We had slept like this for weeks, but this morning it felt different. The ambiguity had been burned away, replaced by the stark, terrifying clarity of what we had done. The door we had been hovering in front of for so long had finally been pushed open, and I had no idea what lay on the other side. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, my movements slow and deliberate, as if I were a bomb disposal expert trying not to trigger a secondary explosion. I went into the kitchen and started the familiar ritual of making coffee, the mundane task of flimsy anchor in a sea of uncertainty. I watched the dark liquid drip into the pot, each drop marking time, counting down to the moment he would wake up and we would have to face what we had done. What had he done? What had I allowed? Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of my relief. Had it been a mistake? A moment of weakness born of loneliness and proximity? The memory of his whisper, "Tell me to stop," echoed in my mind. He had given me the out. He had been prepared for me to say no. What did that mean? When he finally emerged from the bedroom, he wasn't wearing his usual sleepy, soft expression. He was guarded. His shoulders were tense, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. He was wearing the emotional armor I hadn't seen him in since the first few days after his breakup with Sarah. He walked past me to the coffee pot, his movements stiff and unnatural in the shared space that had become so comfortable. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice rough. "Morning," I replied, my voice tight. I held out a mug I had already poured for him. He took it, his fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second. The contact was like a static shock, and he pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. He retreated to the far side of the kitchen counter, creating a physical barrier between us. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. It wasn't the comfortable, companionable silence we had shared for months. It was a void, heavy with unspoken fear and regret. "Julian," I started, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. "Are we okay? What was that last night? Do you regret it?" The questions were a logjam in my throat. He took a long sip of his coffee, still not looking at me. "I should probably get going," he said, his gaze fixed on the street outside my window. "I have a bunch of stuff to do today." Need to call that realtor back. It was a blatant, clumsy deflection. A retreat. He was running. My heart, which had felt so full and hopeful just hours before, felt like it was shrinking in my chest, collapsing under the weight of his avoidance. He was erasing it. He was pretending it never happened. The beautiful, honest moment of the night before was being painted over with the drab, sensible colors of the morning after. Julian, wait, I said, my voice firmer this time. I walked around the counter, closing the distance he had created. We need to talk about last night. He finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes was not anger or disgust, but pure, unadulterated panic. He looked like a cornered animal. There's nothing to talk about, Leo, he said, his voice strained. It was a weird night. We were both tired. It was a mistake. The word landed like a physical blow. It was the one word I had been dreading, the one word that could invalidate everything, that could turn a sacred confession into a sordid, pathetic miscalculation. All the air went out of my lungs. I felt a hot, bitter wave of hurt and anger rise in my chest. All those nights, all that tenderness, the trust, was it all just a mistake? A mistake, I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. You held my face. You asked me to tell you to stop. And when I didn't, you kissed me. That didn't feel like a mistake, Julian. That felt like the most honest thing that has happened between us in 8 years. He flinched, raking a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture of distress. I don't know what I was doing, okay? I'm all screwed up right now. My life is a mess. I was lonely. I leaned on you. I took advantage of you. And I'm sorry. His apology was worse than the accusation of a mistake. It reframed me as a victim, him as the confused aggressor. It neatly absolved him of having any genuine feeling and reduced me to a convenience, a warm body he had used for comfort. The hurt was so sharp, so intense, it felt like I was being hollowed out from the inside. Don't you dare, I said, my voice trembling with a fury that surprised me. Don't you dare make me into some victim in your drama. And don't you dare dismiss what happened as you taking advantage of me. I am not a child, Julian. I am a grown man who has been your friend for almost a decade. I knew exactly what was happening. The only question I have is, did you? The confrontation hung in the air between us, stark and ugly. His face crumpled. The panic in his eyes was warring with a deep, profound confusion. I don't know, he whispered, and the admission was so full of despair that my anger momentarily faltered. Leo, I don't know. I can't. You're my best friend. It's supposed to be simple. It's supposed to be easy. And this is not. I don't know what I'm doing. He turned and walked back into the bedroom, closing the door behind him. The sound of the click was like a gunshot in the silent apartment. I stood alone in the kitchen, my coffee forgotten, my hands shaking. He had retreated back across the border, slamming the gate shut behind him. The bubble had burst, and I was left standing in the wreckage, cold and exposed. He had pulled away, not because he didn't feel anything, but because he did. And the realization was both the most painful and the most hopeful thought I had ever had. He was terrified, and in his terror, he had left me completely, utterly alone with the truth. For the next 3 days, we lived like ghosts in the same apartment. The easy intimacy we had built was shattered, replaced by a tense, excruciating politeness. He started sleeping on the couch again. The first night, I found the bedding laid out neatly, a clear, unspoken statement. He was rebuilding the walls, brick by painful brick. We barely spoke. We moved around each other with the careful, awkward choreography of strangers who had been forced into proximity. The silence in the apartment was no longer a comfort. It was a weapon, a thick, suffocating blanket of everything we weren't saying. I was drowning in it. The hurt had subsided into a deep, aching sorrow. I had risked everything, had opened the locked room in my mind and let my feelings out, only to have them be met with fear and confusion. I felt foolish, exposed, and profoundly lonely. It was worse than the years of silent, unrequited love. This was a shared knowledge that was now being actively denied, and the denial was a constant, painful presence. I couldn't work. I couldn't think. My world, which had been so vibrantly focused on him, had turned gray and muted. On the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. The idea of another night of him sleeping on the couch, of another morning of us avoiding each other's eyes over the coffee pot, was unbearable. I knew that if I didn't do something, This silence would calcify. It would become permanent. Our friendship, the thing I had treasured for so long, would die a slow, quiet death, and the thing that might have been would become a ghost that would haunt me forever. I had to risk the final confrontation. I had to demand the truth, whatever it was. Even if the truth was that he didn't want me, that it was all a mistake, I needed to hear it. The ambiguity was killing me. He was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the dark television screen, when I walked into the living room. I didn't sit down. I stood in front of him, my arms crossed over my chest, a defensive posture I didn't even realize I was taking. He looked up at me, his eyes weary. "We can't keep doing this, Julian," I said, my voice quiet but firm. He sighed, a long, ragged sound of defeat. "I know, I need you to talk to me." I continued, my voice gaining strength. Not the panicked, it was a mistake version. The real version. "I need you to be honest with me. I deserve that. Our friendship, at the very least, deserves that." He was silent for a long time. His gaze dropped to his hands, which were clenched in his lap. I could see the war playing out on his face. The conflict between his fear and his innate sense of loyalty to me, to our history. I waited, my entire body thrumming with nervous energy. I had laid my last card on the table. It was his turn to play. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm scared, Leo," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so scared." The simple, honest confession broke through my anger and hurt. I knelt on the floor in front of him, so we were at eye level. "Scared of what?" I asked gently. "Of this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the space between us. "Of what it means. Of what I'm feeling. I've spent my whole life on a track, you know? A to B to C. Go to school, get a job, get a girlfriend, get married. It was all laid out. I knew who I was. And then everything with Sarah fell apart, and I was lost. And you were there. You've always been there. My anchor." He used the word, Sarah's word, but this time it didn't sting. It sounded like a prayer. He took a shaky breath. "These last few months being here with you, it's been the only time I've felt safe. The only time I've felt home. And I started to need it. I started to need you. Not just as a friend. As something more. And the night I kissed you, it wasn't a mistake. It was the only thing in the world I wanted to do. It felt right. More right than anything has felt in a very, very long time." Tears were tracking down his cheeks now, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. "But the next morning, I woke up and I panicked." He continued, his voice cracking. "Because what does that make me? Who am I if I feel this way? For you? My best friend. A man. It's like my entire compass is broken. Everything I thought I knew about myself is gone. And I was so terrified of what it meant, so scared of ruining the one good thing I have left in my life. You. That I tried to shove it all back in its box. I tried to pretend it didn't happen. And I hurt you. I know I hurt you. I'm so sorry, Leo." His confession washed over me, a wave of relief so profound it left me weak. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified of his own feelings. He was lost in the wreckage of his old life, trying to make sense of the new one that was emerging, a life where his anchor, his harbor, his best friend, was also the person he wanted to kiss. I reached out and took his hands. They were cold and trembling. "You didn't ruin anything," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. "And you didn't hurt me. Not really. I was hurt because I thought I was alone in this. I thought I had imagined it all." I took a deep breath, the last wall around my own heart finally crumbling. "Julian, I have been in love with you for years." The words hung in the air, a final, stunning truth. His eyes widened, his breath catching. He stared at me, a look of dawning, incredulous wonder on his face. "Years?" he whispered. I nodded, a small, sad smile on my lips. "I just got very, very good at hiding it. All those nights on the couch, in my bed, you have no idea what that was like for me. It was heaven, and it was torture." A single tear escaped my eye and tracked down my cheek. He lifted a hand, his touch as gentle and tentative as it had been the night of the kiss, and wiped it away with his thumb. "God, Leo," he breathed. "All this time, you were right there. And I was so blind." "You weren't blind," I said. "You were living your life. And I was your friend. That was enough." "No," he said, his voice gaining a new certainty, a new strength. He squeezed my hands. "It's not enough. Not anymore." He leaned forward, and this time, there was no hesitation. There was no question. He kissed me again, and this kiss was different. It wasn't tentative or soft. It was deep and sure and full of all the words we had been too afraid to say. It was a promise. It was a beginning. It was the sound of two broken compasses finally finding their true north together. We were no longer in the aftermath of the storm. We were in the quiet, sunlit morning, standing in a world that was irrevocably, beautifully, and finally, ours. The conversation that followed was long and quiet, stretching late into the night. We didn't move from our spots, me kneeling on the floor, him sitting on the edge of the couch, our hands clasped between us like a lifeline. We talked about everything. About his fear, his confusion, the slow, dawning realization that his feelings for me were not a symptom of his breakup, but a separate, independent truth that had been growing unnoticed for a long time. He spoke of how my quiet presence had always been a constant in his life, a gravitational pull he had never questioned until he lost every other anchor. He admitted that the need for physical closeness had surprised him, this desperate, primal urge to be held by me, and how it felt more natural and more right than anything he had felt with Sarah, a realization that had both terrified and thrilled him. I, in turn, confessed the depth and breadth of my own long-held feelings. I told him about the ache of watching him with his girlfriends, the quiet resignation I had adopted, the way I had compartmentalized my love for him into the neat, safe box of friendship. I told him how the last few months had been a slow, agonizing process of that box breaking apart, how his grief had inadvertently opened a door I had planned to keep locked forever. It was like lancing a wound, letting out years of pent-up pressure. The honesty was painful, but it was a clean, healing kind of pain. With every secret shared, the space between us felt cleaner, clearer. The ghosts of misunderstanding and fear slowly dissipated, replaced by the solid, grounding presence of the truth. There were no grand declarations, no promises of forever. It was too new, too fragile for that. Instead, we spoke in the language of the immediate future. "I don't want to sleep on the couch anymore," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not unless you're on it with me." I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes for the first time in days. "The bed is better for my back, anyway," I replied, the gentle teasing a welcome return to our old rhythm, now layered with a new meaning. When we finally went to bed, it was with a sense of intention we'd never had before. As I turned off the light, he reached for me in the darkness, and there was no hesitation. He pulled me close, and I went willingly, sinking into his embrace as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It was a homecoming. The days that followed were a study in quiet rediscovery. We were learning a new dance, finding the rhythm of US after years of dancing around it. The changes were small, almost imperceptible to an outside eye, but to me, they were monumental. It was the way he would now reach for my hand when we were walking down the street, his fingers lacing through mine without a second thought. It was the way he started leaving a toothbrush in my bathroom, a silent declaration of permanence. It was the easy, domestic intimacy of making breakfast together in our underwear on a Sunday morning, the air filled with the smell of coffee and the soft sound of our laughter. The ever-present tension that had hummed beneath the surface of our friendship was gone, replaced by a deep, comforting calm. It was the peace of a harbor finally reached after a long and turbulent voyage. He found a new apartment, a bright one-bedroom a few blocks from mine. I helped him move in, and for a terrifying, irrational moment, I was afraid the change in geography would change us, that having his own space would mean a return to the old borders. But the fear was unfounded. He spent the first night in his new place, and I felt his absence in my bed like a physical ache. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text. "My couch is brand new and my bed is empty. It's awful. Can I come home?" My heart swelled. He hadn't said, "your place," he had said, "home." I texted back a single word. Always that night, he was back in my bed, his keys to his own apartment sitting on my nightstand, and we both knew that his new place would be little more than a closet for his clothes. My apartment, our space, was home. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together. The quiet that had once been filled with unspoken yearning and anxiety was now a space of deep contentment. We could sit in the same room for hours, me editing photos, him reading or working on his laptop, and the silence was a comfortable blanket, a shared understanding that needed no words. The love that I had once thought of as a secret, a burden, a hopeless affliction, had become the very foundation of my life. It was no longer a photograph I kept hidden in a darkroom. It was the light I lived in, the air I breathed. It was the quiet joy of waking up next to the person who had always been the center of my world, and knowing, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was the center of his, too. We had found our way out of the ambiguity, not by mapping a new country, but by finally admitting that we were both, and had always been, citizens of the same one.